So Herzl is married, apparently unhappily.
Correct.
3 children,
Yes.
Pauline, Trude, and Hans. As a side note, you and I had discussed off camera Vienna, which was the adopted hometown of Theodor Herzl after leaving Budapest. Interestingly, the area where he lived with his family in Vienna was on the same street as Sigmund Freud.
Right.
And Hans, his son, saw treatment with Sigmund Freud. And if you stand in front of the apartment building where Herzl lived, you can, no joke, you can see the front door down the street of Sigmund Freud's home. There's a cafe not far down the way. It's called Central Cafe. And Theodor Herzl frequented there along with Sigmund Freud. Viktor Frankl did. Apparently, the Central Cafe was a haunting place of a haunted person, that being Adolf Hitler. And so it was a bit of a cauldron of Jewish history in a microcosm, a powerful, powerful microcosm. So he's married, he has 3 children. All of his children lead troubled lives.
It's a real tragic story. So we have the father of the Jewish state, visionary of the Jewish state, with no descendants. He died at 44. He looks quite old in all the pictures and in these busts with the beard, but he was only 44 when he died.
Especially the last few years, he suffered from a heart condition.
Right.
And when you look at pictures of him already in the late 1890s, early 1900s, he looks very unwell. Like you can see, and his unwellness, is that exacerbated by the travel schedule, the demands of the political Zionist movement?
Yes, the travel schedule and the stress that it's not easy being the leader of a Jewish, international Jewish organization. There's lots of views, lots of different ways to get to a common destination. So it was quite stressful for him, lots of fighting, lots of bickering, lots of travel, and he was a sickly person as well. So train travel and the bouncing of the trains was not conducive, and he worked quite hard. He was warned by his doctors, slow down, you're going to kill yourself. Mm-hmm. And he essentially said, I got too much to do in too little time. So he worked even harder. He literally worked himself to death. When he died at 44, he had 3 teenage children. His wife was obviously bereaved and distraught, and she said, "I thought I was marrying a lawyer," and all of a sudden she marries the Herzl morphs into this world Jewish leader. He essentially bankrupted the family, so that they had no money when Herzl died, and the Jewish community had to raise a fund to look after Herzl's children. The children were, under Herzl's will, placed with 3 separate guardians. Their mother had no rights under Austrian law, and so then they were separated, and they grew up in a very regal way. Herzl had an aristocratic demeanor, which manifests itself with his children. So they didn't know how to play with other kids. They were really kept alone and then separated. So ultimately, the oldest daughter, Paulina, in the 1930s, so 25, 30 years later, died of a drug overdose. Hans, who had needed psychiatric, psychological treatment, committed suicide shortly after his sister's death, in part out of guilt for not being there to help her. The mother Julie died about 5 years later, so the kids were orphans by the time you got to 1909. So there was one child left, Trude. She was married, had a child. Trude died in Theresienstadt.
And the child as well?
The child had been sent out to England before the war.
And the kinder transports?
Or the equivalent, I think. and then found his way to Washington, where he was an attaché with the British Embassy. And when he learned about after the war, the death of his parents, he committed suicide in Washington. So it's tragic. Herzl was not a great father. He loved his children, maybe not so much his wife, but he dedicated himself to the cause of the Jewish people. And we're the beneficiaries of his work and his effort and his energies, but his children and grandchild paid the cost for it.
In reading one of the books about Herzl, Amos Alon points out that because of his separation from his wife and because of his long-term unhappiness in his marriage, that Herzl had a number of affairs and he developed syphilis. Alon also hints that Herzl, maybe even separate as a symptom of syphilis, that he displayed traits of manic depression. Was there any hint of that from what you see?
From what I understand, he did frequent the houses of ill repute before he got married. And I'm not aware of any infidelity after he was married, but the part about the syphilis is true from his experiences as a teenager, suffered from syphilis. And there's those that say that one of the consequences of the syphilis was a very bad rash on his face, which caused him to grow this beard to cover it. And also his heart condition, which he ultimately died from, impacted it, as well as certain manic elements, which there's a description of him writing the Judenstadt, walking around Paris, muttering to himself in a manic state, throwing around ideas, talking to himself, then going back to his hotel, the Hotel Castile, where he would sit for days and write items. And he describes that he felt while he was writing this book that an eagle was flapping its wings above his head. So there was a lot going on, and there is, it's not insulting to him to say that he suffered from ailments, mental and otherwise. To me, it's part of his virtue, because he was not some Superman. He was a real person, put on his shoes or his spats, one at a time, that he was able to think at a level, work at a level, and accomplish at a level that was terrific, fantastic, unprecedented. Yet he was a person with issues with his wife, issues with his kids, having, disputes with other people in the Zionist world, had a tough time, had health issues, but even though he was a normal person, was able to accomplish great things, which is an inspiration to all of us. We're, biologically similar, 99.9% to this person, so we all have the power to accomplish great things.
No doubt. So Herzl moves himself now, and he assumes this remarkable mantle, partially by dint of ideas and partially because he realizes, you rightly point out, he needs to move himself from just thinking about something to actually doing something. And he forms the organization, or the organization develops around him, of what, as we acknowledged before, was being this political Zionism. And what do you think, now, and actually before we get to that, Herzl, as we noted, did a considerable amount of travel under the aegis of being the father of political Zionism. I want you to tell our listeners about the one trip he made to Israel, which was a profound one at that.
So in 1898, was his one trip to Eretz Israel, was then part of the Ottoman Empire. The reason for the visit was to meet the Kaiser Wilhelm, who was visiting Israel at the time, and Herzl had spoke to him previously, and the Kaiser suggested, let's continue our discussion on my trip to Palestine. So it's not like Herzl could get on El Al and go there. He had to take a steamer ship to Alexandria, and from Alexandria to Jaffa, and he went with 4 other people, and there was a delegation, and they took some time to visit the colonies that were being developed there.
Colonies such as
Rishon LeZion, Petach Tikva. There was an agricultural school outside of Tel Aviv, Mikveh Yisrael. Jaffa, Tel Aviv didn't exist yet, and then went to Yerushalayim.
But at that time also, which is now a beautiful shopping area in Israel, Sharona, that was part of the Kaiser Wilhelm's German presence in the land of Israel. So just so people understand that most of the major European powers, as the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, there was a land grab going on, and the Kaiser's presence in Israel to cement Germany's foothold in at least in some part of Israel.
Right, and he was there to dedicate a new church that has been built to reflect the German
Augusta
presence.
Victoria,
correct,
which is right by Hadassah Hospital.
Right, and so and he came with a giant entourage. The trip was organized by Thomas Cook, the travel company, with tents, and set up a whole complex in Jerusalem, where the Kaiser took visitors, and Herzl visited him, and they had a discussion outside Mikveh Yisrael. There's a famous picture of Herzl talking to the Kaiser when the Kaiser is on a horse as he's passing through on his way to Jaffa. And Herzl was he had to be very careful. As an example, he went by train from Jaffa to Jerusalem, and which was now the old train stations, now shopping center area, and he stayed in a bed and breakfast in what's now the Mamilla Mall. The Mamilla Mall. It was a Steinmatzky's for a while, but that's where he stayed. It was a 2 or 3 room hotel. He arrived towards sundown on a Friday, and he was not feeling well, but he decided 2 things: not to ride a horse into the city. Now it's probably a 25-minute walk with real roads. Was probably not so easy in 1898, but he was sensitive not to be perceived, because there's a description of the Mashiach coming into Jerusalem on a white horse or a donkey or something like that. So he didn't want to do that. He declined that opportunity. And this is reflective of his knowledge and sensitivity for Jewish practices and Jewish tradition, even though he was not religious himself. He didn't want to take a carriage to his hotel because it would be traveling on Shabbat. And he didn't want to insult the religious residents of Jerusalem by traveling on a carriage on Shabbat. So even though he wasn't feeling well, he walked that distance to the place where he stayed in the Mamilla.
And that kind of principle living, was that consistent with him? Like, clearly he seemed to be a person who had his principles, and was he faithful to them? Because that's a very principled stand.
It's principled, and it's also part of it is political, because not very different than it is now. There's a panoply of views, a rainbow of views in Jewish life, and he needed to have as many as possible behind his plan and not give pretext for people to distance from his plan. And there were those that would say it's not cultural enough. It's more you're creating a Berlin, a German presence on the Mediterranean, or it's not religious enough, or it's not working the land enough. So he was trying to at least not offend people so they could say, aha, Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, which of course it did. And so he was I call him a polypotentialite. He knew a lot about a lot of things. He knew about politics and writing and drama, but he also knew about science and religion and economics and all of these things. And he threw all that.
And the journalism unquestionably enabled his ability to be panoplopic in terms of viewing the world. I want to turn to your collection. And the fact of the matter is we could talk about Herzl for the next hours because he is a compelling human being. What was the first thing you ever collected from of your collection? And if I could just start by saying with the question, rough estimate, how many pieces do you have in your Herzl collection?
I have more than 5,000. Item number one, I mentioned previously my grandparents who moved to Israel in 1954.
Are they buried in Israel?
They are.
And where are they buried?
They are buried in Herzliya.
In Herzliya. And before we move on, Herzliya, the flag of Herzliya famously has 7 stars. Could you explain to the people watching why the flag of Herzliya, the Israeli city named after Herzl, why it has 7 stars?
So in the Jewish state, Herzl described his vision for this Jewish state. Part of it was a manual, a how-to, how to sell things in Europe and move to Eretz Yisrael and all of that. But he envisioned, and this was in 1896, so it was pretty far out progressive thinking at the time, that the workday would have 7 hours. And Herzl designed, he scribbled in his diary, a design of a flag of the Jewish state, which would have 7 Magen Davids, reflective of the 7-hour workday. This is not too distant from the time of Charles Dickens writing about what life was like in working in England at the time, or the sweatshops in America at the time. This was a 7-hour workday, and that's why it's seven stars. And the Tzim shipping line, their logo also has 7 stars. And in Herzliya, the 7 Stars Mall. 7 stars.
So thank you so much. So your first piece.
So my grandparents had a home in Ramat Gan. And in that home was a framed picture of Herzl in the living room. It was a regal frame, beautiful picture. When my grandmother died in 1991, I asked for that as my Yerusha, my inheritance. And so I got it, and I unpacked the frame in order to redo it. And it turned out that this item was a free giveaway in the Haaretz newspaper in 1960 on the occasion of Herzl's 100th birthday. So, and you can see them on eBay. Hundreds, tens of thousands of them were made and given away in the Haaretz. But my grandparents thought so much about Herzl, and they were living in the dream that he helped create, that they took this picture to be framed and hung it as if it's in a portrait gallery, this cardboard portrait of Herzl. That was item number one.
Wow. And of all the items you have, and maybe this isn't a fair question, is there one that you would consider your most beloved?
If I can be indulged and talk about 2.
Sure.
So I have this, it's called a carnet de bal. It's a locket that has a hook, so it would be worn on a chain, and it has a pencil that you take out and it springs open, and inside this locket is a little autograph book. It belonged to Fanny Wolfson. Fanny Wolfson was the wife of David Wolfson, who was Herzl's successor after he died. She obviously took this locket, wore it to various Zionist balls and parties, and had the most prominent Zionists of that time sign her autograph book. And on the top is Herzl, and there's others, Israel Zangwill, Max Nordau, Katz Nelson. And to me, it's reflective of things not being that dissimilar from now, where there were parties and get-togethers and galas and fundraising, right, to help make this work. It's that the work to create the Jewish state and the meetings and the conferences, not that dissimilar to how we try and advance the cause of Israel and Jewish life today. And you'd appreciate this. As a New Yorker, it's the equivalent to me of a 1927 New York Yankees autographed baseball, right? It's got all the stars in it. So that is the unique and jewel of my collection. I was fortunate to get this item in a collection that I bought. I am 59, so by no means young, but in the world of Herzl collecting, I'm extremely young. And from time to time, there are collectors who want to entrust their collection to people who will care for it and who love it and will do good things with it. So I'm usually the first call to buy. They don't give it to me, but I acquired that as part of this. I should say that from time to time, I get in the mail a Herzl book, or Herzl picture, Herzl postcard. People are cleaning up their parents' grandparents' house. They find something.
You're known as the Herzl guy.
Right. And so they want to entrust it to someone who will care for it, and it just arrives in the mail here. I thought you would appreciate this. But once a month, that happens. The second item is on the total opposite spectrum, which is an item I bought on eBay for maybe $35, but I love it dearly, which is a label for a sardine can from the 1920s in Chicago of Herzl brand sardines. And these are Norwegian sardines that somebody, the Continental Canning Company of Illinois, got together with their advertising executives and had a discussion. What's the best way that we can market and promote these salty fish? And someone says, I know, let's call them Herzl brand sardines. And so it's the most preposterous idea, but it's, I guess, suggestive of an affinity, a connection, and a good brand.
Oh, I see.
And so that, and then I learned that, as if that's not bizarre enough, there were two brands of Herzl sardines. In Palestine in the 1930s, there was a separate brand of Herzl sardines. And one might say that's demeaning to affix this dignified historical character who changed the future of the Jewish people and use it to sell little fish. On the other side, it's for a collector, it's fantastic. But it also says this person meant something to somebody, that he wanted to memorialize him by helping him promote a certain brand.
It also shows how pervasive he is as a personality. Tell me about your family. Do they love Herzl too?
They're good about it.
Okay. They have an uneasy relationship with him?
Well, I think it's caused us to go to interesting places in the pursuit of Herzl's life and idea. And 10 years ago around now, actually, on this day, we were it's in the middle of August. We went to Basel to celebrate my 50th birthday. We had a family reunion. There were 27 of us in Basel. So we've been to Basel, we've been to Paris and other places. Our home is a Herzl house. My daughter Orly is a comedian, and so one of her lines is, How many dates does it take until you're comfortable saying that you grew up in a home with the world's largest Herzl collection? My daughter, Yael, she declared her room a Herzl-free zone. There is Herzl in every other room in the house, with the exception of Yael's room. I think they all have a love for the state of Israel. We've traveled to Israel the same way that I went with my parents as a kid. We would take our kids almost every year to Israel. I have a sister who lives in Israel. She's married with 4 kids and now a grandchild. So we would go annually to visit. So they have a love for the state of Israel, which manifests for them in their own way. But I see Herzl as an important person who helped to create this state of Israel, which each of them in their own way love dearly.
Tell us a story about this.
So this is about the largest bust of Herzl I have seen.
I feel like he's here.
Right. It is from the East Side Tourist Center in Manhattan. I have a friend, Danny Levinson, who lives in Lambertville, who is about 80 years old, and he is like the Indiana Jones of Jewish artifacts. So when a synagogue, a Jewish community center in the Lower East Side and the New York region closes down, he will make sure that the Sifrei Kodesh and the Jewish artifacts are not just tossed in a bin or treated, improperly. So he will go in and either deal with the caretaker or the successor owner or whatever to try and rescue items. This was one of the items that he rescued. And it's about, as I said, it's about as big a Herzl bust as you can find.
How old is it?
I would estimate it's from the 40s or so. There are smaller versions of this.
You think it's that late? And the reason why I ask is because the Jewish communities in the Lower East Side had already started filtering out of the Lower East Side starting in the 20s. I wonder if it's even older.
So I cannot tell from it, but it's an interesting perspective. The reason I said it's from the 1940s is I have a smaller version of this, and what happened at the time of Israel's independence, 1948, of course, was there was a new appreciation for Herzl because his dream had been fulfilled, and a new series of Herzl-related items. Herzl was affixed to Chanukiot and ashtrays and all kinds of items. So it's quite possible that the miniature version, which was from the 1940s, was made from an earlier version of this larger version, and I have not had it carbon dated.
Yeah,
so I take your word that it sounds like it might be earlier.
My suspicion would be 2 last questions. First, do you believe, and it should be 61 years from now, that there will be someone that you'll be able to hang your collection to, knowing that Herzl's memory will be curated and cared for and remembered in the way that you've done?
I'm hopeful that's the case. If it's not a person, that it's an institution, a university, a museum. In addition to within the 5,000 items that I described, or because there's busts like this, there's knickknacks, there's a sardine can labels, there's coins and medals and stamps and ice tongs and pen knives and pencils and all kinds of things. There is a collection of Zionist books. Some of them are extremely rare. So those, I feel I have a national treasure of the Jewish people in my home, and it's a responsibility. And I feel that those should be entrusted to a place where they can be used for scholarship.
Question for you.
Yes.
If you were to venture a guess, where do you think the collection, if it does go to an institution, do you think it would be in North America or in Israel?
Should be in Israel. Belongs in Israel. Many of these things don't come from Israel. All right, this was from New York. A lot of things came from Europe. Obviously, a lot of Herzl items were destroyed during the Holocaust, and so, but a lot of the collection is, if it's from before 1948, from Europe. But ultimately, it should be repatriated to Israel if there's a place that will display it. And what I say is, if it's going to be in boxes and in shelves that people can't see, it might as well be here. But if there's anyone who would be interested in creating a home for the collection where people can see and enjoy it and learn from it and be inspired from Herzl's lessons, it would be my pleasure wherever it might be.
Is there a Herzl Museum?
Yes, there's on Har Herzl. There is a Herzl Center, and I'm in regular touch with them. They know about the collection. They have a beautiful museum, but it's an experiential museum to walk through, and you're in the Zionist Congress, and you're in Paris, and but it's not an artifact type museum, with the exception of Herzl's office, which is the very last room there. And so it would be my pleasure to make this available, and while it's here, I do the best I can to use it as a tool to inspire and to educate, and whether it's on through movies or the website that I have or other things for people and discussions such as this. There's so much to learn and be inspired from this guy that will make us all have stronger connections to the state of Israel. And the miracle that we risk taking for granted, if we stop to remember where it came from, we may stop ourselves from taking it for granted.
One of the enduring behaviors or legacies of rabbis is the assumption that we're having a multi-generational conversation. So rabbis from hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, you read their opinions, you talk to them, and you live your life in some way in a conversation with them and in a response to them. What would you like to say to him if you could have met him? What would you have said to Theodor Herzl?
If I met him, let's say I would go in the time tunnel and meet him in 1904, I'd say, keep it up. It's going to happen. Don't despair. It will happen, and you're on the right track, and what you're talking about is critical, and hurry up, because we know, with the benefit of history, the consequences of not having the state of Israel during the Shoah. Of course, when I say hurry up, he'd say, I'm already working as much as I can. What more can I do? If Herzl were alive today, the converse of the question, and the people ask me this a lot, and I would like to hear from him directly. So here's the state of Israel. Look at the miracle. Look, drive around. Look what you see. Look what you started. Is this what you thought? And part will be yes, and part will be no. You know, every step towards peace with our neighbors, close and far, is closer to the realization of Herzl's dream, which was the Jewish people having a right to live in peace and security, look after ourselves, and let the creative energies of the Jewish people flow to benefit the world. The peace part is still a work in progress, but step by step, step by step.
Leave it to the interviewee to, in fact, they make the most salient point, and that is on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the passage of a year, the introduction of another year, we are reminded in our prayers to hurry up. Right? We're finite, and we're taught to make the most of our time, of our ability, and the things that God gives us. This man, in 44 years, certainly did. This book, Collecting the Dream, also I understand that it's available online. And everyone's encouraged to go online and to peruse this remarkable collection. And David Matlow, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's been a treat.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.